German POWs in Texas filed intelligence reports claiming American Rodeos was secret cavalry training. They were dead serious and completely wrong. July 17, 1943, Abilene, Texas Taylor County Fair and Rodeo Grounds. The dust rose in clouds that turned golden in the late afternoon sun, hanging in the still air like smoke from distant artillery. Obergefreiter Klaus Zimmermann pressed his face closer to the chicken wire fence, his knuckles white against the metal. Around him, 24 other German prisoners of war stood in a tight cluster, flanked by 3 bored American guards cradling M1 carbines. The guards were watching the arena. The Germans were watching something they couldn't quite comprehend. A cowboy, if that's what you called him, was attempting to ride what appeared to be an enraged bull. The animal, easily 1,500 pounds of muscle and fury, exploded from a wooden chute with such violence that Zimmermann involuntarily stepped backward. The rider impossibly stayed mounted for 3 seconds, 4, 5, before the bull executed a twisting leap that defied physics. The cowboy went airborne, spinning through the dust cloud, and landed hard enough that Zimmermann felt certain he'd witnessed a death. Then the man stood up, dusted off his jeans, waved to the screaming crowd, and limped out of the arena grinning. Zimmermann turned to his fellow prisoner, Unteroffizier Friedrich Weber, a veteran of the Afrika Korps who'd seen the Kasserine Pass and Tunis. Weber's expression was absolutely serious. "Mounted assault training," he whispered in German. "They're preparing cavalry units for dismounted combat scenarios. The intentional falls. They're conditioning soldiers to survive being thrown from horses under fire." Zimmermann nodded slowly. It was the only explanation that made sense. Why else would the Americans allow enemy prisoners to observe their military training exercises? Neither man could have known that they were watching the Taylor County Fair's weekly rodeo, a pure entertainment spectacle that had been running, war or no war, every summer since 1928. Neither could have imagined that similar scenes were playing out across dozens of POW camps scattered throughout Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Nebraska. And neither could have predicted that their earnest intelligence reports, painstakingly compiled and smuggled back to Germany through neutral diplomatic channels, would become one of the war's most absurd footnotes, a cultural misunderstanding so profound it revealed the vast chasm between 2 worlds at war. This is the story of that collision. The Invisible Invasion. On May 19, 1943, the first trainload of German prisoners of war arrived at Camp Barkley, just outside Abilene, Texas. They came in the night, as most POW transfers did, aboard sealed railway cars that traveled on delayed schedules to avoid publicity. The War Department had been clear. The American public was to be shielded from the knowledge that enemy soldiers, hundreds of thousands of them, were being housed on American soil. The numbers were staggering. Between 1943 and 1946, the United States imprisoned approximately 425,000 Axis POWs in more than 700 camps spread across 46 states. Of these, roughly 50,000 Germans were sent to Texas alone, making the Lone Star State one of the largest POW destinations in North America. These weren't temporary holding facilities. These were entire communities, complete with canteens, theaters, athletic fields, and workshops. At Camp Barkley, the base that had been training American soldiers since 1940 was retrofitted to accommodate 3,000 German prisoners. Camp Hood, further south near Killeen, eventually held over 4,000. Smaller branch camps dotted the landscape, makeshift compounds attached to farms, ranches, cotton gins, and lumber mills wherever labor was desperately needed to replace American workers who'd gone to war. Major General James K. Parsons, commanding officer of the 8th Service Command, which oversaw POW operations across Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Louisiana, faced an unprecedented challenge. The Geneva Convention of 1929 mandated that officer prisoners could not be compelled to work, while enlisted prisoners must be paid for their labor, housed in conditions comparable to the captor nation's own troops, and provided with recreational activities. In Texas. In 1943, this is where the cultural miscalculation began. The Texans and the Teutons, Zimmermann, had been captured on April 23, 1943, during the final Allied push in Tunisia. He was 22 years old, a conscript from a small village outside Heidelberg, who'd seen exactly 8 weeks of combat before British artillery turned his supply convoy into scattered wreckage. He'd surrendered with 60 other survivors, grateful to be alive, terrified of what came next. The propaganda had been explicit. American soldiers tortured prisoners. The Jews who controlled America would exact special revenge on German captives. At best, they'd be sent to labor camps in frozen Canada or steaming jungle clearings to work until they died. Instead, after processing in North Africa and a cramped but uneventful ship journey, Zimmerman found himself in Texas. His first meal at Camp Barkley consisted of fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, fresh bread with butter, and coffee. Real coffee. He ate until he felt sick, convinced it was a trick, a final feast before punishment. The next day they fed him again, and the day after that. He would later write to his mother, in a letter censored but approved by American authorities, "We eat better here than I ate at home before the war." The guards seemed more bored than cruel. "I don't understand this place." The camp itself sprawled across flat, scrubby terrain that stretched to horizons so distant they looked like another planet to men from Central Europe's tight valleys and dense forests. The barracks were wood-frame structures, hot as ovens during the day but bearable at night. Each prisoner received 2 uniforms, dyed to remove German insignia but retaining their basic military character: boots, undergarments, toiletries, and this seemed most bizarre, access to a camp library stocked with German language books. The American guards, many of them older men judged unfit for combat deployment, treated the prisoners with a casual indifference that itself seemed like psychological warfare. Where was the hatred, the revenge? Instead, there were baseball games visible beyond the fence, American soldiers who bummed cigarettes off German prisoners, and a strange, persistent cheerfulness that made no sense to men who'd been taught that war was a civilizational death struggle. Colonel Theodore G. Hamilton, Camp Barkley's POW compound commander, had his own perspective. In a letter to his wife dated June 3, 1943, he wrote, "They expected devils and found farmers. Half my guards are ranch kids who see these Germans as just more hired hands. The prisoners keep asking when the brutal treatment begins. I tell them it already has. We're making them play." Softball. This cognitive dissonance, the clash between Nazi propaganda about American savagery and the reality of West. Texas's pragmatic indifference set the stage for ever deeper misunderstandings. Cowboys and cavalrymen. The first rodeo visit was organized by Lieutenant James R. Buck Wilson, a former ranch hand from Sweetwater, who'd been assigned as recreation officer for the Camp Barkley POW compound. Wilson was 28, exempt from combat duty due to a childhood injury that left him with a pronounced limp. He took his assignment seriously. The Geneva Convention required adequate recreation, and Wilson interpreted this broadly. On July 17, 1943, he loaded 30 German prisoners onto a truck and drove them 12 miles to the Taylor County Fair in Rodeo. 3 guards accompanied them. The security was deliberately minimal. Where exactly were these men going to escape to? Into the endless Texas plains where their accents and military-issue clothes would make them conspicuous within minutes? What Wilson didn't anticipate was how the prisoners would interpret what they saw. To understand the misunderstanding, you must understand both audiences. For the Germans, many of whom came from military backgrounds where every activity served strategic purpose, the rodeo appeared to be exactly what Weber suggested: specialized training. The Third Reich's own military culture emphasized physical conditioning and combat preparation disguised as sport. The Nazi Party's obsession with athletics as warfare preparation had conditioned these men to see physical contests as military exercises. Moreover, several of the prisoners were cavalrymen. The Wehrmacht still deployed extensive horse-mounted units in 1943, particularly on the Eastern Front, where mechanized vehicles struggled in mud and snow. To these men, the rodeo skills looked like exaggerated versions of cavalry techniques they'd learned themselves. Bronc riding, obviously training soldiers to maintain control of panicked horses during artillery bombardment. Bull riding, conditioning men to handle extreme physical trauma and fear. Calf roping, Timed exercise in rapid dismount and target securing, precisely the skills needed to chase down and capture enemy scouts. When a cowboy was thrown hard enough to require medical attention, the Germans noted how quickly he was retrieved, treated, and how the exercises continued without pause. This, they concluded, was America's version of hardening soldiers to casualties, making injury routine so men wouldn't break under combat stress. The crowd's enthusiasm seemed like propaganda support for the military. The announcer's play-by-play was incomprehensible. Most prisoners spoke limited English, but the tone was clearly celebratory, official, supportive. Zimmermann noted in his secret diary, "The civilians attend these training demonstrations with great patriotic fervor. Even women and children come to watch, building morale for the war effort. The Americans' preparation is more thorough than we assumed. And the beer vendors, the concession stands selling popcorn and cotton candy, the children waving American flags, all of it folded neatly into the interpretation. American total war mobilization, where even entertainment was militarized, where the entire society oriented itself toward training and preparation. Nobody told the Germans they were watching a tradition that predated both world wars, that had roots in the working practices of 19th century cattle ranchers, that was as military as a barn dance." The intelligence reports. Here is where the story becomes both darker and more absurd. Hidden within the seemingly benign POW camp system was a shadow network of committed Nazis who'd neither surrendered their ideological beliefs nor their sense of duty. The Geneva Convention allowed prisoners to elect camp spokesmen and organize their own internal hierarchies. In many camps, including Barclay, this meant the most fanatical National Socialists assumed control. At Camp Barclay, that man was Hauptmann, Captain, Otto Kunze, a career officer captured in Tunisia who'd been a party member since 1931. Kunze was 34 years old, a true believer who saw captivity not as an end to his service but as a continuation through different means. He organized the camp's Germans into a disciplined structure, complete with mandatory political education, sessions, secret military training, and, most relevant to our story, intelligence gathering. The US Army knew about this, of course. Regular informants, German anti-Nazis or simply pragmatic prisoners looking for favor, reported everything to American intelligence officers. But the War Department made a calculated decision. Allowing the hardcore Nazis to think they maintained control made the camps easier to manage. Better a structured, hierarchical prisoner population than a chaotic one. As long as intelligence reports could be monitored and nobody was being seriously hurt, let them play their games. Kunze organized what he called reconnaissance reports, detailed observations of everything prisoners saw outside the wire. Work details noted railroad routes, factory outputs and troop movements. Prisoners who attended churches estimated civilian morale, and men who went to rodeos reported on American military training techniques. On July 21, 1943, 4 days after the rodeo visit, Kunze compiled a report based on testimonies from Zimmermann, Weber, and others. The document, written in careful handwriting on paper, scavenged from the camp workshop, detailed the use of livestock in training scenarios to simulate combat unpredictability, conditioning exercises involving deliberate falls from heights of 6 to 8 feet, timed rapid dismount and pursuit drills, large-scale civilian participation in military morale demonstrations, apparent normalization of combat injuries among trainees. The report concluded, American cavalry training continues at high intensity, despite mechanization of forces. Suspect preparation for mountain or rough terrain operations where vehicles cannot operate. Recommend forwarding to OKW Intelligence, OKW, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the German Armed Forces High Command. This is where we must pause to note something important. We know about this report not because it reached Germany, it didn't, but because American counterintelligence intercepted it. Captain Robert M. Blackwood, the military intelligence officer attached to Camp Barclay, read it, blinked in confusion, read it again, and then did something remarkable. He filed it away without comment and let the German prisoners continue attending rodeos. In a post-war interview conducted in 1957, Blackwood explained his thinking. What were they going to do with the information? Even if it somehow got to Berlin, what possible military advantage could Germany gain from believing we were training? Cavalry units in Texas. It was so absurd that it was harmless. And, frankly, the rodeos were good for morale. Both for my guards who got to attend, and for the prisoners who seemed genuinely entertained, even if they didn't understand what they were watching. Throughout the summer and fall of 1943, German prisoners from Camp Barclay attended 6 more rodeos. Similar outings occurred at Camp Hood, at branch camps near Hereford and Levelland, and at facilities across Oklahoma and Kansas. At each event, earnest German soldiers watched, analyzed, and misunderstood. The reality of barbed wire paradise. While the rodeo misunderstanding provides the absurdist comedy of our story, the daily reality of German POWs in Texas was more complex and troubling than simple cultural miscommunication. By December 1943, approximately 35,000 German prisoners were scattered across Texas in various installations. The largest concentrations were at Camps Barclay, Hood, Fannin, Huntsville, and Hearne. Smaller branch camps, over 50 of them eventually, operated as labor pools for agricultural and industrial work. The prisoners picked cotton in the Brazos Valley, harvested pecans in central Texas, cut timber in the piney woods, and worked in food processing plants from Amarillo to Corpus Christi. They were paid 80 cents per day in camp scrip that could be exchanged for cigarettes, candy, toiletries, and other canteen goods. This was officially compliance with Geneva Convention requirements. In practice, it created a bizarre shadow economy. German prisoners had more discretionary income than many rural Texans living through wartime rationing. In small towns, POWs on work details would trade their camp scrip or handiwork for extra food, writing materials, or contraband alcohol. Relationships developed, some friendly, some transactional, some romantic. In Hearne, Texas, a young German corporal named Johann Kunze, no relation to Otto, was beaten to death by fellow prisoners on November 4, 1943, for being too friendly with American guards and local civilians. 5 German POWs were later tried, convicted, and executed at Fort Leavenworth for the murder, the only American executions of German POWs during the war. The incident revealed the violent internal politics of camps where hardcore Nazis enforced ideological conformity. But in other places, different stories unfolded. At a branch camp near Hereford, Texas rancher William Bill McClelland recalled, "We had 12 German boys working the harvest. They worked harder than any locals I could have hired. One of them, a kid named Peter from Bavaria, cried the day we told him the war in Europe had ended, not because Germany lost, because he had to leave Texas." By 1944, approximately 10,000 prisoners were working on Texas farms and ranches at any given time. They lived in improvised barracks, often converted barns or grain storage buildings, slept on army cots, and ate meals prepared by ranch cooks who treated them like any other hired hands. Many worked unsupervised for hours at a time, their only restraint the knowledge that escape was both practically impossible and increasingly pointless. Where would they go? How would they survive? And as news from Europe worsened, the Normandy invasion on June 6, 1944, the Soviet advances, the systematic destruction of German cities, many prisoners began to realize that captivity in Texas might be safer than freedom in Germany. The gradual enlightenment. Understanding, when it came, arrived gradually and then all at once. For Zimmerman, the moment came in October 1944, at a small ranch near Merkel, Texas, where he was part of a work detail repairing fences. The rancher's 10-year-old son, Bobby, had been following the Germans around for days, fascinated by their accents and stories. Bobby spoke no German. Zimmerman spoke broken English, but the boy was persistent. On a water break, Bobby produced a battered magazine with pictures from a rodeo. Through elaborate gestures and simple words, he attempted to explain what a rodeo was. Cowboys, ranch work, entertainment, not soldiers, not military. Zimmerman initially resisted. Clearly, the child didn't understand his own country's military preparations. But Bobby was insistent. He brought his father over. The rancher, a weathered man named Jack Henderson who'd ranched this land for 30 years, tried to explain through a bilingual German prisoner who'd studied English before the war. It's not training, the translator explained. It's like a festival. Celebration, they do it for fun, to show skills from ranch work. Cowboys, like Karl May books, you know Karl May? Zimmerman knew Karl May. Every German boy knew Karl May's wildly inaccurate but beloved novels about the American West. They were fiction, romantic, fantasies about Indians and cowboys that bore no relationship to reality. Except apparently they did. The realization didn't come as revelation, but as slow, embarrassed understanding. Over the following weeks, as Zimmerman and others compared notes, asked careful questions and observed more carefully, the truth became unavoidable. The rodeos weren't military training. The seemingly dangerous activities weren't conditioning exercises. They were watching athletic performances based on actual ranch work, performed by civilians for entertainment. Weber, the Afrika Korps veteran who'd first suggested the mounted assault training theory, was philosophical when Zimmerman confronted him with the truth. So of course it's not military training, he said quietly, staring out at the flat Texas horizon. I knew that by the third rodeo. The Americans don't train like that. They don't train like anyone. They just have so much of everything that they waste it on elaborate entertainments. Then why did you write the intelligence reports? Because Kunze expected them. Because it kept him feeling important. Because what else was I going to do? Tell a true believer Hauptmann that we were being taken to civilian parties. Weber lit a contraband cigarette. Let them think rodeos are military secrets. The intelligence reports make men feel useful. And it's not like the information is reaching Berlin anyway. This was probably true. The elaborate intelligence network the Germans had constructed within the camps was almost certainly compromised at every level. American counterintelligence monitored the mail, controlled the few diplomatic channels available through neutral countries, and ran informant networks inside every major camp. The intelligence reports were mostly theater, prisoners playing at still being soldiers, Americans watching them play. Everyone involved aware of the game but maintaining the pretense. By early 1945, most German prisoners in Texas had figured out the truth about rodeos and much else besides. They understood they were watching civilian entertainment. They understood they were living better as prisoners in America than they would have as soldiers in Germany. And they understood that the war was ending, that Germany was being destroyed, and that their futures were profoundly uncertain. The Reckoning, May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day at Camp Barclay. The German prisoners were assembled in the compound's main yard and informed officially of Germany's unconditional surrender. The American officers expected relief, perhaps celebration from the anti-Nazi prisoners, and sullen resentment from the hardliners. What they got was mostly silence. Zimmerman, by then working full-time at a ranch near Abilene as part of a minimum security labor detail, heard the news from rancher Henderson, who drove out to the worksite with a radio blaring the announcement. Henderson offered his hand. Zimmerman shook it. They stood there for a long moment, German prisoner and Texas rancher, neither knowing quite what to say. What happens now? Zimmerman finally asked in halting English. Don't rightly know, Henderson admitted. Guess you go home eventually. When they figure out how. But home was complicated. By May 1945, much of Germany was rubble. The Soviet occupation of Eastern Germany meant that prisoners from those regions faced unclear fates. The denazification programs, emerging reports about concentration camps, and the general chaos of post-war Europe made the prospect of repatriation frightening. Some German prisoners actively campaigned to stay in America. They petitioned authorities, proposed remaining as agricultural workers, and emphasized their anti-Nazi credentials, sometimes real, often exaggerated. American policy was clear but inconsistently enforced. All prisoners must be repatriated. But the process would take years. Camp Barclay began phasing out operations in late 1945. Prisoners were consolidated into larger facilities to await transportation. The last POWs didn't leave Texas until mid-1946, more than a year after the war's end. During that extended limbo, the relationship between captors and captives evolved into something stranger than traditional prisoner-of-war dynamics. Former enemies attended movies together in town. American guards invited German prisoners to their homes for Sunday dinners. Romances bloomed, against regulations but impossible to fully prevent. In several documented cases, German POWs married American women after eventually returning to the US as immigrants in the 1950s. And yes, they continued attending rodeos. Lieutenant Wilson, the recreation officer who'd organized that first fateful trip in July 1943, kept arranging outings until the camp closed. By 1946, the prisoners knew exactly what they were watching. They cheered for favorite riders, learned the scoring system, and understood the fine points of bull riding versus bronc riding. In one of history's small ironies, several former POWs who later immigrated to America settled in Texas and became genuine rodeo fans. A man named Friedrich Weber, quite possibly the same Unteroffizier who'd first theorized about mounted assault training, appeared in Abilene City Records in 1954 as the owner of a feed store that sponsored a local rodeo. Contestant, we cannot be absolutely certain it's the same man, but the possibility is too perfect to ignore. What it all meant. The story of German POWs and Texas rodeos is fundamentally a story about perspective, how two groups of people can observe the same event and construct entirely different meanings based on their cultural frameworks and expectations. For the German prisoners, especially in those early months of 1943, everything had to be interpreted through the lens of total war. The Third Reich's propaganda machine had spent years teaching them that modern warfare consumed entire societies, that every activity served the state's military purposes, that America was simultaneously decadent and dangerously powerful. When they saw rodeos, they couldn't simply see entertainment. They had to find the military application because their worldview demanded it. For the Americans, the cultural blind spot was different, but equally revealing. The casual decision to take enemy prisoners to public events reflected a confidence bordering on arrogance. The United States was geographically invulnerable in a way European nations could never be. The war was something happening over there, not here. Taking POWs to rodeos wasn't a security risk, because the very idea of enemy soldiers on American soil was already so abstract that a few more hours of freedom made no difference. But underneath the absurdity runs a darker current. The humane treatment of German POWs in Texas stands in stark contrast to the simultaneous treatment of Japanese Americans, who were imprisoned in internment camps under far harsher conditions despite being American citizens. It reveals the racial hierarchies embedded in American society. White German soldiers received better treatment than Asian American civilians. It also highlights the vast gulf between the European and Pacific theaters. While German prisoners picked cotton in Texas and watched rodeos, American POWs in Japanese camps endured starvation, disease, and systematic brutality. The asymmetry wasn't lost on Americans with loved ones suffering in places like Bataan or Changi. There were protests, angry letters to congressmen, and bitter resentment that the enemy was living comfortably while American boys died. The Army's response was pragmatic. The Geneva Convention protected American POWs abroad only if America honored it at home. Mistreat German prisoners, and Japan and Germany could justify mistreating American captives. It was a cold calculation, but it saved lives. From the 425,000 Axis POWs held in America during World War II, only a handful of serious escape attempts occurred, and virtually none succeeded for any length of time. The combination of geographic isolation, decent treatment, and the growing realization that Germany was losing created a stable, manageable system. The camps worked precisely because they defied prisoners' expectations of how captivity should function. And sometimes, in the intersection of efficiency and humanity, you get German soldiers watching cowboys ride bulls and earnestly reporting it as military intelligence. Epilogue. The last rodeo, June 14, 1946, Abilene, Texas, Taylor County Fairgrounds. The war had been over for 13 months. Camp Barkley was officially closed, its POW compounds empty, except for administrative personnel processing final paperwork. Most of the German prisoners had been repatriated by ship through East Coast ports, loaded onto vessels bound for Bremen or Hamburg, and returned to a country many of them barely recognized. But on this warm June evening, 3 former prisoners sat in the public stands at the Taylor County Rodeo. No longer flanked by guards, no longer wearing uniforms marked with PW stencils. They were civilians now, legally if not yet emotionally, wearing clothes donated by local churches and carrying temporary papers that identified them as displaced persons awaiting immigration processing. We don't know their names for certain. The documentation is incomplete, the records scattered across archives in 3 countries. But we know from local newspaper accounts that former POWs did attend, that the community welcomed them, and that the scene would have been impossible to imagine just 3 years earlier. They watched the same events that had once seemed like military training: bronc riding, bull riding, calf roping, barrel racing. They ate the same concession stand food, popcorn, peanuts, cotton candy, that American families around them consumed. When a cowboy took a particularly hard fall and got up grinning, they might have remembered their first confused interpretations, their elaborate intelligence reports, their certainty that everything must serve some strategic purpose. Or maybe they just enjoyed the show. Sometimes the hidden stories of World War II aren't about battlefield heroics or intelligence coups or technological breakthroughs. Sometimes they're about the fundamental strangeness of human beings trying to understand each other across chasms of culture, language, and experience. Sometimes they're about the absurd moments when those misunderstandings get revealed, when the military intelligence turns out to be cowboys, when the enemy becomes familiar, when the war ends but the people remain. The German prisoners who mistook rodeos for military training weren't stupid. They were people trapped in an ideological framework so rigid that it couldn't accommodate the possibility of useless excellence, of people doing difficult, dangerous things simply because they were worth doing, because they were fun, because they connected to a heritage that had nothing to do with war. That inability to imagine life beyond utility, beyond state purpose, beyond military application, that was the real prison. And for some of those men, Texas didn't just change their circumstances. It changed their understanding of what human beings could be when they weren't being molded into instruments of national power. The rodeo continued. The cowboys rode, the bulls bucked. And somewhere in the stands, men who'd once been enemies learned that not everything worth watching is preparing you for battle. Sometimes, it's preparing you for something much harder: peace.